But could such a move from the UK signal good news for Hamas and undermine Israel's efforts in the Middle East? Well, joining me now to say precisely that is former British Army Commander Colonel Richard Kemp. Colonel Kemp, thank you very much for joining us on the show. It's always a pleasure to have your company. Colonel Kemp, you wrote in the Telegraph today saying the West is handing victory to Hamas. Would you care to explain to our viewers what you meant by that?
Well, I think this sort of thing going on in the House of Commons, which of course is pointless in terms of any real effect it will have. Certainly Israel is not going to initiate an immediate ceasefire on the basis of a vote in the House of Commons. And Hamas, of course, certainly won't take notice of it from that point of view. What it does, though, is to encourage Hamas. Hamas want to see this sort of movement around the world. They want to see anti-Israel motions. And effectively, this is an anti-Israel motion. If Parliament was calling on Hamas to cease fire, to lay down its weapons, to end the bloodshed and to hand back the hostages, then that would be something else. But this sort of thing is purely encouraging Hamas. And the article I wrote that you mentioned was more about the US administration's drafting of a UN Security Council resolution also calling for a ceasefire, although not an immediate ceasefire. And calling on Israel not to complete the destruction of Hamas in Rafah, while at the same time telling the world that the civilians in Rafah should not be allowed to leave Rafah. So it's really an impossible situation that they're trying to put Israel in. And all of this stuff, I think the vote in the Commons, the UN Security Council draft resolution, it's all designed simply to appease and to pander to the anti-Israel, pro-Hamas electorates back in their countries, in the US and the UK and other countries. And it's very dangerous because, as I said, it does encourage Hamas, and it will, if anything, encourage Hamas to hold on, to fight on. And it will also endanger the Jewish community in the UK. These demonstrations, these protests you see outside the House of Commons, they're designed for one thing, and that is to bully and intimidate the Jewish community in the UK.
And Colonel Kemp, you talk about defeatist policies being adopted by the West, drawing upon mistakes, historical mistakes, and you talk about the weeping sores of Iraq and Afghanistan, not getting the job done now, not finishing off Hamas, of course, would surely allow them to simply regroup and repose a fresh threat in the future, Colonel Kemp.
Of course, we've seen this time and again in Israel. We've seen Hamas attacking Israeli civilians with rockets. We've seen Israel occasionally going into Gaza, carrying out other forms of attack from the air. And ultimately, it does damage Hamas. All of these operations do damage to Hamas. But Hamas then lick their wound, supported by Iran, funded by Iran, Qatar, and in many cases by our own taxes via aid that finds its way to Hamas. And pose a threat again, with the ultimate threat being the 7th of October. And Hamas leaders have said, as part of their genocidal campaign against Israel, they've said they will do the same again and again and again if they get the chance. So they must be stopped. They have to be crushed. If they're not crushed now, then the threat will rise its head yet again.
Colonel Kemp, Christopher Hope here with Martin in the studio. Do you think it makes any difference what Parliament decides? We know what the UK government's position is. That won't change from this debate in the Commons. Does it have any bearing? Is Israel watching? Is Hamas watching what happens in the House of Commons today?
Israel is watching, absolutely. Israel regards Britain as being a very close and very supportive ally in this, and will be concerned about this display of, let's say, public sentiment rather than government sentiment. Albeit that the call for a ceasefire, in my view, represent only a minority opinion in the UK, whatever the outcome of the vote is. But Hamas are watching, I think, much more closely. And as I mentioned, this will encourage Hamas. Hamas is on its last legs. Hamas has had at least a half, probably more than half of its fighting capability destroyed so far in this war. And what remains is essentially it's been largely taken apart and is fighting in small groups, not a coherent entity. The reports that the Hamas leaders in Gaza are unable to communicate, and they're focusing more on their own survival rather than directing the war against Israel. But this does encourage that. It does give them hope, and it will probably, this sort of movement here and in other countries actually encourages Hamas to fight on and leads to more and greater bloodshed than otherwise might occur.
Okay, Colonel Richard Kemp, thank you very much for joining us. The West is handing victory to Hamas, he says in that column earlier. Thank you for joining us on the show.